She grew up believing love was light, but she met love in the darkness. He only knew how to dominate, because loving was a risk he never wanted to take again. In the closed room, faced with pain, she felt desire being born amidst fear. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. Ashford wasn't born cruel. He was shaped that way, molded by hands he could no longer remember, and losses that carved themselves into his bones until there was nothing left but edges. At 38, he'd built an empire that stretched across 3 continents, a network of companies whose names appeared in financial papers with the kind of reverence usually reserved for old gods. His fortune was obscene, his reputation wrapped in silence and fear, and his face, sharp-jawed, dark-eyed, beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, moved through charity galas and corporate boardrooms like a warning no one dared to speak aloud. People knew almost nothing about Cain Ashford, only that he was irresistibly dangerous, that his lovers vanished without leaving traces of affection, as if they'd been erased from his life with the same clinical precision he applied to hostile takeovers. His contracts were ice-cold, but his eyes always seemed on the verge of combustion. Controlling, obsessive, too intelligent to be manipulated, Cain had constructed his empire on the rubble of a past he buried beneath each new pleasure purchased, each new submission extracted with words that wounded deeper than any touch ever could. The mansion sat like a tombstone in the Yorkshire Dales, all grey stone and shuttered windows, surrounded by moorland that stretched toward nothing. Ashford Manor. It had been in his family for generations, though Cain preferred his London penthouse for business. The estate was where he came to disappear, to indulge in appetites the city couldn't quite contain. It was where he brought women whose names he'd forget before dawn, where contracts were signed in rooms that smelled of old leather and older secrets. It was where he would bring Eve Hartley, though she didn't know it yet. Eve was 22 and still carried questions in her eyes, the kind of questions that hadn't been beaten out of her by disappointment or time. She'd grown up in a stone cottage on the edge of a village in Devon, where the church bells marked every hour, and her mother's piano filled the spaces in between. Margaret Hartley had been a music teacher once, austere but devoted, a woman who believed that faith and beauty were 2 names for the same salvation. Eve had been raised on hymns and poetry, on the idea that love should be gentle rather than fierce, a steady flame instead of a wildfire. She was a virgin by choice and by faith, guarding her body the way one guards a temple, not out of fear, but out of a hope that persisted despite everything. There was a purity to Eve that wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate, insistent, a refusal to let the world make her smaller than she was. But there was a shadow too, one that had followed her since she was 17. A man from the church, someone everyone respected, someone her mother trusted. He'd cornered her in the vestry one Sunday after evensong, his hands too familiar, his breath sour with communion wine. She'd managed to escape before he could finish what he'd started, but the memory clung to her like smoke. Since then, she'd associated desire with guilt, not out of shame, but because trauma had taught her that want and danger wore the same face. She'd never told anyone. Not her mother, not the vicar. The man had moved away 6 months later, and Eve had learned to lock certain doors inside herself. Now, at 22, she worked at a bookshop in Exeter, living in a rented room above a bakery, sending money home every month because her mother's pension barely covered the medications. Multiple sclerosis. That's what the doctors called it, though Margaret called it God's will, which was her way of refusing to complain. The disease was eating away at her, slow and methodical, and the NHS could only do so much. Private care cost more than Eve could ever earn selling poetry collections to tourists, which was how she found herself sitting in a solicitor's office in London on a grey Tuesday in October, staring at a man in a perfectly tailored suit who spoke in the measured tones of someone delivering a business proposal rather than destroying her life. "Your mother has already agreed," Mr. Pemberton said, sliding the contract across his mahogany desk. The arrangement would last 1 year. A marriage in legal terms, though the specifics are outlined in the document. Mr. Ashford requires a wife for personal reasons he's not obliged to disclose. In exchange, your family receives a lifetime pension of £10,000 per month, all medical expenses covered in perpetuity, and a lump sum of £200,000 upon successful completion of the contract term. Eve's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, willing them to stillness. My mother agreed to this without asking me? Pemberton's expression didn't change. Mrs. Hartley is of sound mind and legal capacity to make decisions regarding her family's welfare. She seemed to believe you would understand the necessity. Necessity. The word tasted like ash. Eve looked down at the contract, at the dense paragraphs of legal language that reduced her life to terms and conditions. 12 months. Her presence required at Ashford Manor. Conjugal rights explicitly stated. A non-disclosure agreement that would follow her to the grave. What if I say no? Then the offer is withdrawn. Your mother continues with NHS care, and Mr. Ashford finds another suitable candidate. Pemberton folded his hands. I should mention that he selected you specifically, Miss Hartley. This isn't a general solicitation. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. He selected me. He doesn't even know me. Mr. Ashford is a thorough man. He knows what he needs to know. Eve thought of her mother in that cottage, the way her hands trembled when she tried to button her cardigan, the way she smiled and said it didn't matter when she spilled her tea. She thought of the medical bills stacking up, the care home brochures she'd been collecting, knowing she'd never afford any of them. She thought of the rest of her life, small and careful, watching her mother fade while she sold books to strangers and pretended that was enough. I need to think about it, she said, though she already knew. Necessity had teeth. You have 48 hours, Pemberton replied, standing to indicate the meeting was over. After that, Mr. Ashford will make alternative arrangements. Eve met Cain Ashford 3 days later, in the drawing room of his London townhouse in Belgravia. She'd signed the contract that morning, her signature barely legible because her hand wouldn't stop shaking. Now she sat in a chair that probably cost more than her annual salary, waiting for the man who'd bought her. When he walked in, the air changed. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though he was in a way that felt almost violent. Dark hair swept back from a face all sharp angles and harder edges, eyes so deep brown they looked black in certain lights, a mouth that suggested cruelty even in repose. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of controlled grace that came from absolute certainty in one's power. He wore his wealth casually. Dark trousers, white shirt with the sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle, no tie. Everything about him said he didn't need to try, but it was more than his appearance. It was the weight of his presence, the way he seemed to fill the room just by existing in it. Eve felt herself shrinking, her breath going shallow, every instinct screaming at her to run. Miss Hartley. His voice was low, rough-edged, with an accent that suggested expensive schools and old money. He didn't offer his hand. I trust Pemberton explained the terms. Yes. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. She cleared her throat, tried again. Yes, he did. Cain studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His gaze moved over her slowly, cataloguing details, and Eve fought the urge to cover herself even though she was fully dressed in the navy dress she'd bought specifically for this meeting. She felt stripped anyway, exposed in ways that had nothing to do with clothing. You're younger than I expected, he said finally. I'm 22. It was in the file. Numbers on paper don't convey much. He moved to the sideboard, poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if she wanted one. He handed her one anyway. You look frightened. I'm not. A lie, and they both knew it. Good. Fear makes people stupid. He took a drink, watching her over the rim. We leave for Yorkshire tomorrow. A car will collect you at 10. Bring whatever you need, though you'll be provided with a wardrobe. Mrs. Carmichael, the housekeeper, will handle those arrangements. Eve's fingers tightened around the glass. Can I ask why? Why me? Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to name. Does it matter? I'd like to understand what I've agreed to. You've agreed to be my wife for 1 year. That's all you need to understand. He set his glass down, moved closer. Eve's heart kicked against her ribs. But since you're curious, you remind me of someone. Someone I lost a long time ago. Not in appearance, but in... He paused, searching for the word. In the way you look at pain. Like you recognize it, but won't let it swallow you. Most people either flinch or feed on it. You do neither. Eve didn't know what to say to that. The whiskey burned in her throat. I don't love you, Cain continued, matter of fact. I won't love you. This arrangement is transactional, but I'll honor my end of the contract, and I expect you to honor yours. That includes sharing my bed. Do you understand? Heat flooded her face. The contract mentioned conjugal rights. Yes, I'm not interested in a platonic arrangement, Miss Hartley. If that's a problem, now is the time to walk away. She thought of her mother. The pension. The medical care. The life she'd never have otherwise. She thought of the man in the vestry, the way his hands had felt like violence. She thought of every reason she had to say no and the one reason she couldn't. I understand, she whispered. Kane's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Good. Then we have an agreement. The drive to Yorkshire took 6 hours, though Eve barely noticed the scenery. She sat in the back of a black Mercedes, driven by a silent man named Porter, watching England slide past the window in shades of grey and green. Kane had gone ahead earlier that morning, some business that couldn't wait, and Eve was grateful for the solitude. It gave her time to think, though thinking only made the panic worse. She'd called her mother before leaving London. Margaret had cried, but they were tears of relief, not sorrow. "You're saving us," she'd said, her voice trembling. "You're an angel, Eve, an answer to prayer." Eve hadn't felt like an angel. She'd felt like Judas, selling herself for silver, though the price was higher and the betrayal more intimate. Ashford Manor appeared as the sun began its descent, all Gothic grandeur against a darkening sky. It was massive, far larger than Eve had imagined, with towers and battlements that belonged in another century. The grounds stretched for acres, surrounded by moorland that seemed to go on forever, empty and wild. There were no neighbours, no village lights in the distance. Just the manor and the endless moor and the gathering dark. Mrs. Carmichael met her at the door. She was perhaps 60, grey-haired and severe with pale eyes that gave nothing away. "Miss Hartley, welcome to Ashford Manor. I'll show you to your rooms." Not your room, rooms plural. Eve followed the housekeeper through a grand entrance hall, all marble and dark wood, up a sweeping staircase, down a corridor hung with portraits of Ashford's long dead. Their eyes seemed to follow her, judging. The suite was on the second floor overlooking the moor. Bedroom, sitting room, ensuite bathroom, all decorated in creams and golds that should have been warm but felt cold somehow, impersonal. A wardrobe had already been filled with clothes in her size, dresses, shoes, lingerie that made her blush just looking at it. "Dinner is at 8, Mrs. Carmichael said. "Mr. Ashford expects you in the dining room. I'll send someone to help you dress." "That's not necessary. Mr. Ashford expects it." The housekeeper's tone left no room for argument. "I'll return at 1:45. When the door closed, Eve sank onto the bed, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. The room was beautiful and terrible, a gilded cage with windows that looked out on nothing. She thought about running, about calling a taxi and fleeing back to London, to Devon, to anywhere that wasn't here. But she'd signed the contract, taken the money, made promises she couldn't break without destroying her mother's future. Necessity had teeth, and they were already sinking in. At 7:45, a young woman knocked. Mary, she said her name was, one of the maids, and helped Eve into a dress of deep emerald silk that clung to curves she'd never paid attention to. Mary arranged her dark hair, applied subtle makeup, spritzed perfume at her wrists and throat. When Eve looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The girl from Devon was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone who belonged in this world of silk and shadows. The dining room was cavernous, the table long enough to seat 20, but set for 2, one at each end. Candles flickered in silver candelabras. Kane was already there, standing by the fireplace with a glass in his hand, wearing black like a man in mourning. He turned when she entered, and that same intensity from the day before rolled over her like a wave. "You clean up well," he said, which wasn't quite a compliment. "Thank you." Eve took her seat, conscious of Mary and another servant hovering in the shadows, waiting to serve. "The house is impressive. It's a mausoleum, but it serves its purpose." Kane sat at the far end of the table, the distance between them absurd. "I don't entertain here. No guests, no parties. It's just us, the staff, and the ghosts." Eve tried to smile. "You believe in ghosts?" "I believe the past doesn't stay buried no matter how deep you dig." He gestured, and the servants brought the first course, some kind of soup Eve couldn't name, too rich, too strange. "Eat. You look like you'll break in a strong wind." She ate because it was easier than arguing, though the food tasted like nothing. Kane watched her throughout the meal, hardly touching his own plate, and Eve felt every second of his attention like a physical thing. When the servants cleared the dessert, untouched on both ends, he stood. "Come with me." It wasn't a request. Eve followed him through corridors she'd already forgotten, past rooms whose doors remained closed, up another flight of stairs to the 3rd floor. He stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, one that looked like all the others but felt different somehow, heavier. "This room is locked," Kane said, producing a key from his pocket. "It will remain locked. You're not to enter it, not to ask about it, not to attempt entry. Do you understand?" Eve stared at the door, at the key in his hand. "What's inside?" "Nothing that concerns you." His voice had gone cold, final. "Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good." He pocketed the key again, then turned to face her fully. "Your room is downstairs, but you won't be sleeping there tonight." Eve's mouth went dry. "I thought—" "You thought wrong." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell him, smoke and whiskey and something darker, something that made her heart race for reasons she couldn't name. "We're married as of this afternoon. Pemberton handled the paperwork, which means tonight is our wedding night. This afternoon. It was in the contract, a civil ceremony by proxy. Legal and binding." His hand came up, fingers brushing her jaw, tilting her face toward his. Eve froze, caught between the urge to pull away and the strange, shameful desire to lean into his touch. "I'm not a patient man, Eve, and I don't believe in wasting time on courtship or pretense. You knew what you were agreeing to. Now we both honor the agreement." Eve's breath came in shallow gasps. "I know." His thumb traced her lower lip and she shivered. "That's part of why I chose you. Purity has its own appeal." His eyes were black now, pupils swallowing the brown. "But understand this, I'm not gentle. I'm not kind, and what happens between us tonight will hurt. Not because I'm cruel, though I am, but because first times always do, and I won't lie to you about it." Tears pricked her eyes. "Please what? Please be gentle. Please wait." He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "No, you made your choice. Now we both live with it." He took her hand, led her to his bedroom at the other end of the hall. The room was dark, dominated by a massive 4-poster bed draped in black. He closed the door behind them, locked it, and Eve heard the click like a cell door closing. "Undress," Kane said. Eve's hands shook as she reached for the zipper of her dress. It took 3 tries to get it down, and when the silk finally pulled at her feet, she stood in nothing but the delicate lingerie Mary had helped her into, lace and satin in ivory white, bridal without the ceremony. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly desperately aware of her vulnerability. Kane circled her slowly, a predator assessing prey. "No, arms down. I want to see you." She lowered her arms, forcing herself to breathe. He stopped in front of her, close enough to touch but not touching yet. Just looking, cataloguing, claiming with his eyes what he'd already claimed on paper. "You're afraid," he observed. "Yes. But you're not leaving." "No." "Why not?" Eve lifted her chin, met his eyes even though it cost her. "Because I keep my promises." Something changed in his expression, too subtle to read. "So do I." He reached out, fingers hooking into the strap of her bra, pulling her closer. "Remember that when it hurts. Remember that I'm keeping my promise too." He kissed her then, and it wasn't gentle or sweet or any of the things Eve had imagined a first kiss should be. It was consuming, demanding, his mouth hard on hers, his tongue forcing entry, claiming territory. Eve made a sound, protest or surrender, she couldn't tell, and Kane swallowed it, one hand fisting in her hair, the other at the small of her back, pressing her against him. She could feel his body, hard and hot through his clothes, could feel the evidence of his desire pressing into her belly, and fear in something darker, something that felt dangerously like want, tangled in her chest until she couldn't tell them apart. When he pulled back, she was gasping. He wasn't. "Get on the bed," he said. Eve climbed onto the mattress, her whole body trembling. Kane removed his shirt slowly, revealing a chest mapped with muscle and scattered with scars, thin white lines that spoke of violence she couldn't imagine. He undressed without ceremony, without shame, and Eve looked away when he pushed his trousers down. Her face burning. "Look at me," his voice was iron. "If we're doing this, you look at me." She forced her eyes back, forced herself to see him naked and unashamed, and so perfectly made it was almost painful. He climbed onto the bed, kneeling between her legs, hands already working the clasp of her bra. It fell away. Then the scrap of lace that passed for knickers, and she was bare, exposed, more vulnerable than she'd ever been in her life. "It's going to hurt," Kane said again, his hands on her, thighs spreading them. "I'm not going to stop." It wasn't just about her body. It was about what was about to happen between them, the threshold they were about to cross. Eve felt tears spill over, hot on her cheeks, but she didn't look away. She watched as he positioned himself, felt the blunt pressure, the moment of resistance before the tearing, the burning, the fullness that stole her breath. Pain. Yes. Sharp and immediate and worse than she'd expected. But underneath it, something else. Something that felt like being cracked open, not just physically but existentially. Like something inside her was being ripped apart not by the act, but by his presence. By the weight of him, the reality of him, the terrifying aliveness of what they were doing. And strangest of all, she felt more alive than she ever had. Kane moved, and the pain shifted, deepened, but Eve didn't cry out. She bit her lip, tasted copper, and held his gaze because surrendering that felt like surrendering everything. His face was a mask of concentration, jaw tight, eyes burning, and she realized with a shock that this was costing him something too. Control, maybe, or the illusion of it. When it was over, he pulled away, left her empty and aching. He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort, just rolled to his side, one arm thrown over his eyes, breathing hard. Eve curled into herself, feeling the wetness between her thighs, blood and other things, and tried not to shake apart. "You can cry," Kane said after a long silence. "I won't judge you for it." But Eve didn't cry. She just lay there in the dark, feeling the ache, feeling the strange new awareness of her body, of his body beside hers, of the year stretching ahead like a sentence. And she wondered who she'd be when it was over. If she'd recognize herself at all, if there'd be anything left to recognize. Outside, the moor wind howled against the windows, and the ghosts of Ashford Manor settled in for the long night ahead. Eve woke to grey light filtering through heavy curtains and the immediate awareness that she was alone. The sheets beside her were cold, no indent in the pillow where Kane's head had been, as if he'd never been there at all. For a moment she wondered if she'd dreamed it. The pain, the intimacy, the terrible vulnerability of being opened by someone who looked at her like she was a puzzle to solve, rather than a person to know. But the ache between her thighs was real, and the dried blood on the sheets was real, and the emptiness beside her was perhaps the most real thing of all. She sat up slowly, her body protesting, and found a silk robe draped across the foot of the bed. Not hers. It smelled of him, smoke and something darker, cedar maybe, or sandalwood. She wrapped it around herself and padded to the bathroom, a sprawling marble affair with a clawfoot tub and a shower large enough for 4. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror, she stopped. Bruises, small ones finger-shaped on her hips where Kane had gripped her, a mark on her throat she didn't remember him making. Her lips were swollen, her hair a wild tangle, and her eyes looked different somehow, older, changed. She touched her reflection, half expecting the glass to ripple like water, to reveal that the girl from Devon had dissolved completely and someone else had taken her place. The shower was too hot, but she didn't adjust it, letting the water scald her skin until she felt clean, or at least less marked. She dressed in clothes from the wardrobe, dark jeans, a soft cream sweater, boots that fit perfectly even though she'd never given anyone her shoe size. Everything fit perfectly. Kane had been thorough, just as Pemberton had said. Downstairs she found Mrs. Carmichael in the breakfast room, laying out coffee and toast and eggs that Eve's stomach immediately rebelled against. The housekeeper's pale eyes assessed her with an expression Eve couldn't read. "Mr. Ashford left for London at dawn," Mrs. Carmichael said. "Business. He'll return Friday evening." That was 4 days away. Relief and something that might have been disappointment tangled in Eve's chest. "Did he leave any instructions?" "You're to make yourself at home. The library, the music room, the grounds, all available to you. There are only a few rooms that remain locked." The housekeeper poured coffee with precise movements. "I'll give you a tour after breakfast, show you where everything is." Eve forced herself to eat a piece of toast, though it tasted like sand. "The locked rooms. Is that normal?" Mrs. Carmichael's expression didn't change. "Mr. Ashford values his privacy. There are parts of his life not meant for sharing. But I'm his wife. You're contracted to be his wife. There's a difference. The housekeeper softened slightly, or perhaps Eve imagined it. You'll find Mr. Ashford is a complicated man, Miss Hartley. He has his reasons for everything, even when those reasons seem cruel. Eve wanted to ask more about Cain, about the house, about why a housekeeper would defend a man who'd just bought a bride like one might buy a painting, but something in Mrs. Carmichael's face suggested the conversation was over. So she ate her toast in silence and tried not to think about the year stretching ahead of her like a prison sentence. The tour revealed Ashford Manor to be even larger than Eve had imagined. 37 rooms, Mrs. Carmichael informed her, not counting the servants' quarters or the extensive cellars. The ground floor held the formal rooms: drawing room, dining room, library, billiard room, conservatory. The first floor was mostly guest bedrooms, all beautifully furnished and completely unused. The second floor held the family quarters, Cain's bedroom, Eve's suite, and several other rooms whose purposes Mrs. Carmichael glossed over with practiced vagueness. The third floor was different, quieter. The corridor had fewer windows, and those it had were shuttered. Most of the doors were locked, including the one Cain had shown her the night before. Mrs. Carmichael didn't linger there, hurrying Eve back down to the more hospitable floors with an urgency that felt like warning. "What's in those rooms?" Eve asked as they descended. "Storage, mostly. Old furniture, family archives. Nothing of interest." "And the room at the end of the hall?" "The one Mr. Ashford specifically mentioned." Mrs. Carmichael stopped on the landing, turning to face Eve with an expression that was almost pitying. "Some doors are locked for good reason, Miss Hartley. Best not to wonder what's behind them." But Eve had never been good at not wondering. Curiosity was woven into her bones, the same curiosity that had led her to read forbidden books as a child, to question her mother's rigid faith, to apply to university even though they couldn't afford it. Locked doors weren't warnings. They were invitations. The library became her refuge. It was vast. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves connected by a spiral staircase, filled with books that ranged from medieval manuscripts to contemporary fiction. Someone had loved this room once. The leather chairs were worn in a way that suggested frequent use, and the books showed signs of being read rather than displayed. Eve wondered if it had been Cain or someone before him, someone who'd found comfort in words when the world became too sharp. She lost herself in novels, in poetry, in anything that could transport her away from Ashford Manor and its suffocating silences. But even the books couldn't quiet the questions circling in her mind. Why had Cain chosen her specifically? What did she remind him of? And who was the someone he'd lost? On the second day, she found the piano. It was in the music room, a grand Steinway positioned to face windows that overlooked the moor. The instrument was pristine, professionally maintained, though Mrs. Carmichael claimed no one had played it in years. Eve's fingers found the keys hesitantly at first, playing the simple hymns her mother had taught her, then the more complex pieces she'd practiced alone in the cottage, filling the silence with something other than her own thoughts. She was deep in a Chopin nocturne when she felt the presence behind her. She turned to find Mrs. Carmichael in the doorway, her face strangely pale. "You play beautifully," the housekeeper said, her voice oddly thick. "My mother taught me." Eve's hands rested on the keys. She was a music teacher before she got sick. Mrs. Carmichael stepped into the room, moving as if drawn against her will. "There was someone else who played like that. Same delicacy of touch, same feeling. I haven't heard anyone play that piece since—" She stopped abruptly. "Since a long time ago." "Who?" Eve asked, though she already suspected. "It doesn't matter. The past is past." But Mrs. Carmichael's eyes were haunted, and Eve saw something crack in the woman's severe facade. "Play something else. Something happy." Eve played Debussy, light and dancing, and watched as Mrs. Carmichael stood by the window, staring out at the moor with an expression that looked dangerously close to grief. When the piece ended, the housekeeper left without a word, and Eve was alone again with the piano and the gathering dark. The note appeared on the third day. Eve had been exploring the conservatory, a glass-roofed room filled with exotic plants that seemed too lush for Yorkshire, when she returned to her suite to find a piece of paper on her writing desk. Heavy cream stationery, no envelope, just a single line in elegant handwriting. "You shouldn't have come here." Her heart kicked. She turned, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. The door had been locked, she was certain of it. She always locked it now ever since that first night. But there was the note, undeniable, and suddenly the suite felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. She found Mrs. Carmichael in the kitchen, supervising dinner preparations. "Did someone enter my room today?" The housekeeper frowned. "Only Mary to refresh the linens. Why?" Eve hesitated, the note burning in her pocket. "No reason. I thought I'd misplaced something." But that night, lying awake in the too large bed, Eve couldn't stop thinking about it. The handwriting had been feminine, flowing. Nothing like Kane's angular scrawl she'd seen on the contract. Someone else was in the house. Someone who wanted her to know she wasn't welcome. The second note came the next morning, slipped under her door while she slept. "He'll destroy you like he destroys everything beautiful." Eve's hands shook as she read it. She thought about going to Mrs. Carmichael, but something stopped her. If the housekeeper was involved, or if whoever was writing the notes was someone Mrs. Carmichael protected, then speaking up might make things worse. Instead, Eve tucked the note away with the first one, hiding them in the bottom of her suitcase, and tried to pretend nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. The house felt different now, full of watching eyes and breathing shadows. Eve found herself looking over her shoulder, jumping at ordinary sounds, questioning every moment of solitude. When Friday came, she was almost grateful that Kane would be returning. At least his cruelty was direct. He arrived as darkness fell, the sound of his car on the gravel drive announcing his presence before he ever entered the house. Eve had been in the library, curled in one of the leather chairs with a book she couldn't concentrate on, and she felt the change in the air the moment he crossed the threshold. The house seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath all week. She found him in his study, a room she hadn't been shown during the tour, sitting behind a massive oak desk with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked tired, she thought, shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. But when he saw her in the doorway, something shifted in his expression. "Come here," he said. Eve crossed the room on legs that trembled, stopping in front of the desk. Kane studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes roaming over her face, her body cataloguing changes she wasn't aware of. "How was your week?" he asked, which seemed absurdly domestic given the circumstances. "Quiet. You explored the house." Not a question. Eve wondered what Mrs. Carmichael had told him. "You said I could." "I did." He took a drink, never breaking eye contact. "Did you find anything interesting?" The notes burned in her mind, but she kept her face neutral. "Books, a piano, not much else." "Liar," Kane's smile was sharp. "You're thinking about something. I can see it in your eyes. What is it?" Eve's pulse quickened. "Nothing. I'll know eventually. I always do." He stood, moving around the desk with that predatory grace that made her want to run. "But we can discuss it later. Right now I'm more interested in whether you missed me." "I barely know you. That's not what I asked." He was close now. Close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, the familiar scent of his cologne. "Did you miss me, Eve?" The honest answer was complicated. She'd been relieved by his absence, yes, but also strangely unmoored, as if some essential gravity had been removed. The house felt emptier without him, even though his presence was the most dangerous thing in it. But she couldn't say that. Couldn't admit that he was already getting under her skin in ways that terrified her. "I was fine," she said instead. "Fine." Kane's hand came up, fingers brushing her jaw in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Such a nothing word, be honest. The truth won't hurt you. You will." "Yes." He leaned in, his mouth close to her ear. "But you'll let me anyway, won't you?" Eve's breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to pull away, to maintain some shred of dignity, but her body was already responding to his proximity, heat pooling low in her belly, her skin suddenly too sensitive. It had been this way since that first night, as if he'd unlocked something in her that she couldn't close again, a door to wanting that she'd kept bolted her entire life. "I don't understand what you want from me," she whispered. "Don't you?" His lips brushed the shell of her ear. "You're smarter than that. You want my body. You've already taken that. That's the contract. What I want is different." He pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes black with desire and something else, something hungrier. "I want you to choose it. Not because you're obligated, but because you want me as much as I want you. That's not possible, isn't it? His thumb traced her lower lip, the same gesture from that first night. Then why are you trembling? Why is your breathing ragged? Why can I see your pulse racing in your throat? Because she was terrified. Because she was alive. Because standing this close to him felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, and some terrible part of her wanted to jump. But she couldn't say any of that. So she said nothing, and Kane smiled like he'd won. Go to my room, he said. Wait for me there. What if I don't? Then I'll come find you. And when I do, it will be worse. He released her, stepping back. Your choice, Eve. It's always your choice. But it wasn't, and they both knew it. She was bound by contract, by necessity, by the invisible chains of money and obligation. Still, as she walked through the darkened corridors to his bedroom, Eve couldn't shake the feeling that she was choosing this in some fundamental way. That every step she took was an admission of something she wasn't ready to face. Kane's bedroom was dark except for the fire burning in the hearth. Eve stood by the bed waiting, her heart hammering against her ribs. When he finally appeared, he'd removed his jacket and tie, rolled his shirt sleeves, made himself comfortable while she was still wound tight as wire. Undress, he said, echoing that first night. But this time, Eve's hands didn't shake quite as much. This time she knew what was coming. The silk dress pooled at her feet. She'd worn it to dinner, some absurd attempt to look composed. And then the lingerie followed. Kane watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable until she stood naked before him. Do you know what you look like right now? He asked, moving closer. Eve shook her head. Like a sacrifice, like something too pure for this world. He circled her slowly. It makes me want to ruin you. You already have. No. He stopped in front of her, one hand curving around her throat, not squeezing, just holding, claiming. I've barely started. What happened before was just the opening act. Now we get to the interesting part. He kissed her then, and it was different from before, slower, deeper, as if he had all the time in the world to explore her mouth, to learn the shape of her surrender. Eve felt herself melting into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and Kane made a sound low in his throat that sent heat coursing through her veins. When he pulled back, they were both breathing hard. On the bed, he said, On your back. Eve obeyed, her body remembering the pain from before, tensing in anticipation. But Kane didn't rush. He undressed slowly, deliberately, letting her watch. And this time Eve didn't look away. She studied him. The broad shoulders, the muscled chest with its constellation of scars, the narrow hips, the evidence of his desire. He was beautiful in a brutal way, like a sword or a storm, and something in her responded to that violence even as her mind recoiled. He knelt between her legs, hands on her thighs, and for a moment just looked at her. Eve felt exposed in a way that transcended nakedness, as if he could see through her skin to the frightened girl beneath, the one who'd never felt safe with wanting, who'd learned to equate desire with danger. Tell me if it hurts, Kane said, which was almost laughable given his warnings before. But then he touched her, and it wasn't the brutal claiming of that first night. His fingers were gentle, exploratory, learning the geography of her body with a patience that surprised her. He found places that made her gasp, made her arch into his touch, made sounds escape her throat that she didn't recognize. The pain was still there when he entered her, but it was different now, sharper but briefer, eclipsed quickly by something else. Pressure, fullness, a strange, building tension that felt like standing at the edge of something vast. Kane moved slowly at first, watching her face, gauging her reactions. And Eve watched him back, saw the concentration in his expression, the way his jaw tightened when she shifted her hips, experimenting. It was still a claiming, still about power, but there was something mutual in it now. A conversation conducted in gasps and touches, and the slick slide of skin on skin. When the tension broke, Eve cried out, her body convulsing around him in a way that felt like shattering. Kane followed shortly after, his face buried in her neck, and for a moment they were both lost, both vulnerable, both more human than either of them had been in a very long time. In the aftermath, Kane rolled away, but this time he didn't leave. He lay beside her, one arm flung over his face, breathing hard. Eve curled onto her side, watching him, seeing something in his profile that looked almost like pain. Why me? she asked into the silence. "I told you. You remind me of someone." "Who?" Kane was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My sister, Stella, she disappeared when I was 14. Eve's breath caught. Disappeared. Ran away. Or was taken. I never knew which." His voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow made it worse. "One day she was there, the next she was gone. No note, no explanation. My father looked for her for years. Hired investigators. Offered rewards, nothing. It was like she'd been erased from existence. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago, but the tension in his body said otherwise. You have the same look she had. Like you're watching the world from somewhere else, cataloging pain but not letting it touch you. Like you're stronger than anyone gives you credit for." Eve didn't feel strong. She felt raw, opened, more vulnerable than she'd ever been. But she understood what he meant. She'd survived the man in the vestry, survived her mother's illness, survived being sold into marriage. Survival was its own kind of strength. "Do you think she's still alive?" Eve asked. "I don't let myself think about it." Kane lowered his arm, turned to look at her. "Caring what happened to her would mean admitting I failed her. That I should have protected her and didn't. It's easier to bury it. But it's not buried. That's why you locked that room, isn't it?" "It's hers." Kane's expression went dark. "Don't presume to understand me." "I'm not. You're just asking questions you have no right to ask." He sat up, the moment of vulnerability slamming shut like a door. "This arrangement doesn't include my past. You want to know me, Eve? Then know this. I'm not capable of the kind of love you're looking for. I'm broken in ways you can't fix. Whatever you think you see in me, it's a lie." "I don't think I see anything," Eve said quietly. "Except a man who's terrified of feeling something real." Kane's laugh was bitter. "And you're the expert on real feeling? You who sold yourself for money." The words hit like a slap. Eve flinched, pulling the sheet around herself. "That's not fair." "No, but it's true." He stood, pulled on his trousers. "You made a choice, same as I did. We're both here because we want something we can't have otherwise. Don't romanticize it." He left then, walking out of his own bedroom and leaving Eve alone with the cooling sheets and the terrible realization that he was right. She had sold herself, had chosen money over dignity, security over self-respect. The fact that she'd done it for her mother didn't make it noble. It just made it slightly less mercenary. But the worst part was that she couldn't regret it. Not entirely. Because lying in Kane's bed, marked by his touch, changed by what they'd done together, she'd felt more alive than she ever had in her careful life. And that terrified her more than anything else. She returned to her own suite as dawn broke, crawling into sheets that smelled of lavender and loneliness. The house was waking around her. She could hear Mrs. Carmichael moving downstairs, the clatter of breakfast preparations. Normal sounds in an abnormal life. On her writing desk she found another note. He killed the last one who got too close. You'll be next if you're not careful. Eve's hands shook as she read it. Killed. The word seemed too extreme, too dramatic. But then she thought of Kane's darkness. The violence she could feel coiled beneath his skin, the way he talked about control like it was the only thing keeping him human. And she wondered what had really happened to Stella, what was in that locked room, what secrets Ashford Manor held in its stone bones, and whether in trying to understand Kane Ashford, she was walking toward salvation or damnation. Outside, the moor stretched endlessly under a grey sky, and somewhere in the house, footsteps echoed where no one should be walking. Eve tucked the note away with the others, evidence of a mystery she couldn't ignore, and tried to tell herself that she was still in control. But control, she was learning, was just another word for the lies we tell ourselves to feel safe, and safety had never been part of the contract. The notes continued, appearing with an irregular rhythm that kept Eve constantly on edge. One would arrive every few days, slipped under her door or left on her desk or tucked into a book she'd been reading in the library. Each one was more unsettling than the last. He sees you as a replacement. Nothing more. The house has eyes. Be careful what you do in the dark. Ask him about the fire. Ask him what really happened to his father. Eve kept them all, a growing collection of warnings that she studied late at night when sleep wouldn't come. The handwriting was elegant, educated, feminine. Not Mary's. Eve had seen the maid's writing on a shopping list, all cramped letters and uncertain spacing. Not Mrs. Carmichael's either, though Eve couldn't say how she knew. It was someone else. Someone who knew things about Cain that even he might not want remembered. The mention of fire particularly troubled her. She'd found no evidence of a fire at Ashford Manor, no charred timbers or rebuilt wings. But there was a portrait in the main hall, Cain's father presumably, a man with the same dark eyes and harder mouth that hung slightly crooked, as if it had been removed and replaced hastily. And when Eve asked Mrs. Carmichael about the late Mr. Ashford, the housekeeper's face went carefully blank. He died when Cain was young, was all she'd say. A tragedy best left in the past. But the past wasn't staying buried, no matter how many locked doors Cain installed or how many rooms he declared forbidden. It leaked through the floorboards, whispered in the corridors, left notes in elegant script that smelled faintly of lavender and old grief. Eve became obsessed. She spent her days exploring the manor with systematic thoroughness, mapping its geography, testing doors, searching for secrets. Most of the house was exactly as Mrs. Carmichael had described, beautiful, well-maintained, utterly impersonal. But the third floor remained a mystery, that long corridor of locked doors that no one spoke about. She tried picking the locks with hairpins like she'd read about in novels, but the mechanisms were too sophisticated, too modern. She considered asking Cain directly, but the memory of his face when she'd mentioned Stella, the way he'd shut down, turned cruel, kept her silent. Whatever was behind those doors, he'd locked them for reasons that went beyond simple privacy. Cain himself was gone more often than not, spending long stretches in London on business he never discussed. When he was at Ashford Manor, he was different than he'd been those first days, more distant, more controlled, as if the vulnerability he'd shown that night in his bedroom had frightened him into retreat. He still came to her bed, still claimed her body with a thoroughness that left her shaking, but there was something mechanical about it now. A performance of desire rather than desire itself. Eve should have been relieved, should have been grateful for the distance. Instead, she found herself missing the intensity of those early encounters, the sense that something real was happening between them, even if that something was dark and dangerous. She'd glimpse him sometimes in his study, staring at nothing with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and wonder what ghosts haunted him, whether they were the same ones leaving her notes. It was Mrs. Carmichael who finally cracked, though crack was perhaps too strong a word. It was more like a controlled release of pressure, a decision to share just enough truth to prevent an explosion. Eve had been playing piano, Rachmaninoff this time, something melancholic and Russian that matched the grey afternoon, when the housekeeper appeared with tea, real tea in a proper service, as if Eve were a guest rather than a purchased wife. They'd fallen into a strange routine over the weeks, these small gestures of normalcy that neither acknowledged. "You play like her," Mrs. Carmichael said, setting the tray down with hands that trembled slightly. "Stella." She had the same touch, the same feeling for the music. Eve's hands stilled on the keys. "You knew her well." "I was her aunt. Her mother's sister." The admission fell like a stone into still water. "I came to Ashford Manor when she was 10, after my sister died. Someone had to look after the children, and their father certainly wasn't capable." Eve turned on the piano bench to face the older woman properly. "Cain said Stella disappeared." "She did. When she was 16 and Cain 14. Mrs. Carmichael's face was carved from stone, but her eyes were wet. "One morning she was simply gone. No note, no explanation. The police searched for weeks, assumed she'd run away, gotten herself in trouble with some boy. But I knew better." "What did you know?" "I thought that she'd been planning it, saving money, gathering her mother's jewelry, stealing documents from her father's study. She was meticulous, my Stella. When she did something, she did it thoroughly." Mrs. Carmichael poured tea with shaking hands. "I found things after she left. Drawings she'd made of the house with certain rooms marked, a calendar with dates circled, and a letter hidden in her mattress that she never sent." Eve's heart hammered. What did it say? Oh, that she was leaving. That she had to. That staying would destroy her. The housekeeper's voice cracked. She wrote it to Cain. Tried to explain why she couldn't stay, why their father was... She stopped abruptly. "I shouldn't be telling you this." "Please," Eve said softly. "I need to understand." Mrs. Carmichael looked at her for a long moment, pale eyes searching Eve's face for something. Trust, perhaps, or worthiness. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she continued. Richard Ashford was not a good man. Oh, he was respectable enough on the surface. Wealthy, connected, charming when it suited him. But behind closed doors, she paused, choosing her words carefully. He had appetites, dark ones. And when my sister died, when there was no one to check him, those appetites turned toward his daughter. Eve felt sick. He abused her. I didn't know. Not until it was too late. Stella hid it so well, and I was too blind to see. But Cain knew. He tried to protect her, tried to stand between them, but he was just a boy. What could he do against a man like that? Mrs. Carmichael's hands twisted in her lap. The night she disappeared, there was a confrontation. I heard shouting, breaking glass. By morning, Stella was gone, and Richard was in his study with a bottle of brandy, claiming she'd run off with some boy. That she was ungrateful, disturbed, he made Cain believe it too. But Cain said his father searched for her. A performance for the police, for society. He didn't want her found. He wanted her disappeared. Mrs. Carmichael met Eve's eyes. Richard Ashford died 6 months later. House fire, the inquest said, started in his study, where he'd fallen asleep drunk with a lit cigarette. But I've always wondered. About what? Thursend, whether it was really an accident. Whether Cain, who was home that night, who'd been alone in the house with his father, had finally stopped being a victim and become something else. The housekeeper's voice was barely a whisper. I've never asked him. Some questions are better left unanswered. Eve's mind reeled. The fire. The notes had mentioned the fire. Had Cain killed his father? Was that the darkness she felt coiled inside him? The violence that simmered just beneath his skin? And if he'd killed once, why are you telling me this? Eve asked. Because you need to understand what you're dealing with. Cain isn't cruel for sport, Miss Hartley. He's cruel because cruelty was taught to him. Because he learned that love is just another word for pain. He's trying to recreate something with you, though I don't think he realizes it. Trying to save Stella through you or punish himself or both. Mrs. Carmichael stood, smoothing her skirt. But you're not Stella. You're stronger than she was, I think. Strong enough to either save him or run before he destroys you both. She left Eve alone with the piano and the terrible weight of understanding. So much made sense now. Cain's obsession with control, his inability to trust, the locked rooms and buried secrets. He wasn't just damaged. He was constructed from damage, built from the ashes of his father's house and his sister's disappearance into something hard and unyielding. But the notes. The notes suggested Stella wasn't just a ghost in Cain's past. They suggested someone knew something, someone who was still here, still watching. And if Mrs. Carmichael had been Stella's aunt, devoted enough to stay on at Ashford Manor all these years, desperate enough to tell Eve the truth, was it so impossible to imagine she might also be the one leaving notes, trying to protect Eve from repeating Stella's fate? Eve had to know, had to find proof, and that meant getting into that locked room on the 3rd floor, no matter what it cost. The opportunity came 3 days later, when Cain was in London, and Mrs. Carmichael took the afternoon to visit a doctor in York. Mary and the other staff were occupied with their usual duties, and the house settled into its midday quiet. Eve had been waiting for this, planning for it. She'd watched Mrs. Carmichael's routines, noted when the housekeeper checked the 3rd floor, once in the morning, once before bed. Hours of opportunity in between. She climbed the stairs with her heart in her throat, carrying tools she'd gathered over the past week. A letter opener, a set of small screwdrivers she'd found in a maintenance closet, a hairpin. Pathetic weapons against modern locks, but she had to try. The corridor was dim even in daylight, the shuttered windows keeping out all but the thinnest illumination. Eve counted doors, 6 in total, all locked. She started with the one Cain had specifically forbidden her from entering, the one at the end of the hall. The lock was sophisticated, a deadbolt that wouldn't yield to hairpins or screwdrivers. Eve was about to give up when she noticed something. The doorframe was old wood, original to the house, and time had warped it slightly. There was a gap, barely visible, between the door and the frame at the top corner. She retrieved a chair from one of the other bedrooms, climbed up and peered through. The room beyond was dark, but she could make out shapes. A bed neatly made. A dresser, walls covered in something she couldn't quite discern, and on the dresser, catching what little light filtered through, a photograph in a silver frame. Eve climbed down, frustrated. She needed to get inside, needed to see what Kane was hiding. She tried the other doors, found them similarly secured except for one. The third door on the left gave slightly when she pushed, the lock engaged but the bolt not quite catching. An oversight, or perhaps intentional, a room not quite important enough to secure properly. It took 15 minutes of careful work with the letter opener, but eventually the lock clicked. Eve's hands were shaking as she pushed the door open. The room was a study of sorts, smaller than the others, with a writing desk positioned under the window. The shutters here were open, and late afternoon light revealed a space that looked frozen in time. The desk was covered in papers, books, sketches. The walls held photographs, dozens of them, showing a young girl at various ages. Dark hair, delicate features, serious eyes that looked haunted even in childhood. Stella. Eve moved through the room as if through water, everything slowed down by the weight of discovery. The photographs showed Stella alone mostly, or with a younger boy who had to be Kane. Same dark eyes, same angular features, but softer somehow, less carved by suffering. There were no pictures of their father, she noticed. It was as if Richard Ashford had been excised from family memory even before his death. The desk drawers yielded more treasures. Sketchbooks filled with Stella's art, mostly landscapes, the more rendered in charcoal and pencil, but also darker images. Hands reaching, shadows in doorways, a man's silhouette that radiated menace even as a simple outline, and tucked in the bottom drawer, wrapped in silk, a leather-bound journal. Eve's hands trembled as she opened it. Stella's handwriting was elegant, controlled, the same script she recognized from the notes. Her breath stopped. It was Stella. Stella had been leaving the notes, but how? She'd disappeared 24 years ago. She'd be 40 now, far too old to be sneaking around Ashford Manor undetected. Unless, Eve read, and the world shifted beneath her feet. The journal entries were dated starting when Stella was 14. They chronicled her life at Ashford Manor in prose that was both lyrical and devastating. Her father's nocturnal visits, her attempts to tell people who wouldn't listen, her brother's futile efforts to protect her, and then, on a page dated 3 days before her disappearance, a single entry that made Eve's blood run cold. "I'm leaving tonight. I have to. Father's getting worse, and Kane is starting to look at me the way father does. Not with desire, thank God, but with a kind of desperate ownership that frightens me. He wants to save me, but salvation from Kane would just be another kind of cage. I've arranged passage to Edinburgh. There's a women's shelter there, people who help girls like me. I'm taking mother's jewelry, enough to start over. I've written Kane a letter explaining everything, though I don't know if I'll have the courage to leave it. He'll blame himself. He always does. But this isn't his fault. The monster was always father, and now that I'm leaving, Kane will be free too. I pray he doesn't waste his freedom on revenge." But there were more entries dated years later, in shakier handwriting. "I've been in Edinburgh 9 years now. I have a new name, a new life. I teach music at a school for girls, help them the way I wished someone had helped me. But I still dream of Ashford Manor, still dream of Kane, wondering what he became. I hired an investigator last year, learned that father died in a fire, that Kane inherited everything, that he's become exactly what I feared, hard, ruthless, incapable of trust. I did that to him. My running broke something that was already cracking. And then, most recently, dated just 3 months ago, I came back. I had to see for myself what he'd become. Mrs. Carmichael, Aunt Helen, helped me. She's kept my secret all these years. Told Kane I was dead because it seemed kinder than admitting I chose to stay away. But when she told me about the marriage contract, about the girl he'd chosen who reminded him of me, I couldn't stay away any longer. I'm living in the old gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of the property. Aunt Helen brings me supplies, tells me about Eve. She seems kind. Too kind for Kane. I've been leaving her notes trying to warn her, but I don't think she understands. Kane will destroy her the way our father destroyed me. Not with violence, but with love twisted into possession. I have to stop it. I have to face him. But every time I try, I lose my courage. The final entry was dated 2 days ago. Eve plays piano like mother did. I listened from outside the music room window. It made me weep. Kane has chosen well, she's everything I wasn't. Strong where I was weak. Brave where I fled. Maybe she can save him. Maybe that's why I haven't revealed myself. Because if I appear now, if he knows I'm alive and chose to stay away, it will destroy whatever capacity for love he has left. But the notes aren't working. Eve is falling for him. I can see it in the way she moves through the house, like she's already claimed by ghosts. I need to do something more direct. I need to... The entry ended abruptly, unfinished. Eve's hand shook as she closed the journal. Stella was alive, living in a cottage on the property. Leaving notes, watching, and Mrs. Carmichael, Aunt Helen, had known all along. Had lied to Cain for 24 years, letting him believe his sister was dead or lost forever. The implications crashed over Eve like waves. Everything she'd thought she understood about this place, about Cain, about her role in his psychological drama. It was all built on a foundation of lies. He didn't know Stella was alive. Didn't know she'd chosen to disappear rather than trust him with the truth. Didn't know she'd stayed away deliberately, letting him carry the guilt and grief of her absence like stones in his pockets. And Eve, what was she supposed to do with this knowledge? Tell Cain and watch him shatter, keep the secret and become complicit in the deception. Find Stella and demand answers. She was still standing in the room, frozen by indecision, when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Heavy footsteps. Male. Cain. Eve's heart stopped. He wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow. She'd been so careful, so certain she'd have time. She looked around wildly for somewhere to hide, but the room was small, sparsely furnished. The footsteps grew closer, and Eve made a decision born of panic. She grabbed the journal, tucked it under her sweater, and stepped into the corridor just as Cain reached the top of the stairs. He stopped when he saw her, his dark eyes taking in her presence on the forbidden floor, the open door behind her, the guilt that must have been written all over her face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt electric, dangerous. "What are you doing here?" His voice was soft, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. Eve lifted her chin, refusing to cower. "Looking for answers. In a room I explicitly forbade you to enter." "Yes." Cain moved toward her slowly, each step measured, controlled. When he reached her, he didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the whiskey on his breath. He'd been drinking. "That was never good. What did you find?" he asked. Eve's mind raced. The journal pressed against her stomach felt like a brand, like evidence of betrayal. Pictures of Stella. And drawings. "Is this her room?" It was her room. Cain looked past her into the space, his jaw tight. "I kept it the way she left it. Thought maybe if I preserved it perfectly, she'd come back. Childish, magical thinking, but I was a child when she left." "Cain, I should punish you for this." He returned his gaze to her face, and there was something wild in his eyes, something barely restrained. "Breaking into forbidden rooms, violating the few boundaries I've set. What do you think would be appropriate? Another clause in the contract? A financial penalty?" "You could just talk to me," Eve said quietly. "Tell me the truth instead of locking it away." "The truth?" Cain laughed, bitter and sharp. "You want the truth? Fine. My sister ran away because our father was raping her and I was too weak to stop it. I tried, God knows I tried. But I was 14 and he was a grown man, and every time I stood between them, he'd just wait until I was at school or asleep or distracted. So Stella left, chose the streets over staying with me. That's how much my protection was worth. That's not... And 6 months later, I waited until he was drunk, until he'd passed out in his study with a cigarette still burning, and I locked the door from the outside. Made sure the windows were sealed. Stood in the garden and watched the smoke pour out, watched the flames take the whole east wing, and I felt nothing. Relief maybe, satisfaction, but not guilt. Never guilt." His hand came up, gripping her chin hard enough to hurt. "So yes, Eve, I'm a murderer. I killed my father and I'd do it again. Does that frighten you?" Eve's eyes stung with tears, but not from pain. From the terrible rawness in his voice, the admission that must have cost him everything. "No, it makes me understand you better. Understanding won't save you from me. I don't want to be saved from you." The words escaped before she could stop them, truthful and damning. "I want to understand you. She stopped, uncertain. "What?" Cain's thumb brushed her lower lip, the gesture almost tender despite his grip. "What do you want, Eve?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I came here thinking this was temporary, that I could endure a year and walk away unchanged. But I'm already different, already marked by you, and I don't know if that's surrender or something else." Kane stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he kissed her, and it wasn't the controlled claiming she'd grown accustomed to. It was desperate, almost violent, his mouth crushing hers as if he could devour her uncertainty and replace it with something simpler: want, need. The terrible inevitability of two people who'd been damaged in similar ways finding each other in the dark. Eve kissed him back just as desperately, her hands fisting in his shirt, the journal between them pressing into her skin like a secret heartbeat. She should tell him, should reveal what she'd learned, that Stella was alive, that everything he'd believed for 24 years was a lie. But the words wouldn't come, drowned by the intensity of his mouth on hers, his hands roaming her body, claiming territory even as he gave up something essential. He pulled her into Stella's room, his sister's preserved shrine, and took her against the wall beneath photographs of a girl who'd fled rather than trust him to save her. It should have been wrong, transgressive, but it felt like exorcism, like Kane was finally confronting the ghost that haunted him, acknowledging that some things couldn't be locked away or controlled. Afterward, they lay on the floor in a tangle of limbs and shed clothing, breathing hard. Kane's hand traced patterns on Eve's bare shoulder, idle and almost affectionate. It was the most peaceful she'd ever seen him. "I need to tell you something," Eve began, the weight of the journal in her mind making silence impossible. But before she could continue, a sound cut through the quiet. A woman's scream, high and terrified, coming from outside. They dressed quickly, racing down the stairs and out into the gathering dusk. The scream came again from the direction of the moor, and Kane ran toward it with Eve stumbling behind. They found Mary collapsed on the path, her face white with terror, pointing toward the edge of the property. "In the cottage," she gasped. "There's someone in the old gamekeeper's cottage, a woman. I saw her through the window." Kane went very still. "A woman?" "Yes, sir. I was walking back from the village and I saw a light. And when I looked in, I saw her, sitting there like she owned the place. And she looked up and saw me, and I swear she looked like—" Mary stopped, as if saying it aloud would make it real. "Like who?" Kane's voice was deadly quiet. "Like the girl in the photographs. The one in the frame in your study." "Your sister, sir." The world seemed to stop. Kane turned to Eve, and in his eyes she saw everything crashing down. The carefully constructed walls, the years of grief, the certainty that Stella was gone forever. And Eve realized with terrible clarity that she'd waited too long, that the truth was about to destroy them both. "She's alive," Kane whispered. And it wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "How long have you known?" Eve's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Guilt must have been written all over her face, because Kane's expression went from shock to betrayal, to a fury so cold it froze her blood. "How long?" 20 minutes, Eve stammered. "I just found out. There was a journal, and I was going to tell you. I swear I was—" But Kane was already moving, striding toward the cottage with purpose that looked dangerously like violence. Eve ran after him, her heart in her throat, knowing that whatever happened next would either save them or shatter them beyond repair. The gamekeeper's cottage was small, barely more than 2 rooms, with a light burning in the window. Kane didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, and Eve followed, breathless. A woman sat at a small table, a cup of tea steaming in front of her. She looked up as they entered, and Eve's breath caught. It was like looking at a ghost. Stella was older than in the photographs, 40 now, with threads of grey in her dark hair and lines around her eyes. But the resemblance to Kane was unmistakable. The same angular features, the same haunted eyes. Brother and sister stared at each other across the small room, and the silence stretched so long and so tight that Eve thought it might snap and cut them all. Then Stella spoke, and her voice was soft, broken, absolutely wrecked. "Hello? Kane, I've been waiting for you to find me." For a moment that stretched into eternity, no one moved. Kane stood frozen in the doorway of the cottage, his face a landscape of emotions too complex to name: shock, fury, grief, something that might have been relief if it hadn't been buried under 24 years of accumulated damage. Stella remained seated, her hands wrapped around the teacup as if it could anchor her to reality, her eyes never leaving her brother's face. And Eve stood between them, witness to a reunion that felt more like a collision, feeling the weight of secrets and lies pressing down, until she could barely breathe. "You've been waiting for me to find you." Kane's voice was hollow, each word carefully controlled, as if speaking too loudly might shatter him. "How generous. 24 years and you've been waiting." Stella flinched but held his gaze. "I know you're angry." "Angry?" The word came out like a gunshot. Kane stepped further into the cottage, his whole body coiled with tension. "Angry doesn't begin to cover what I am." "I thought you were dead." "I thought—" His voice cracked and he stopped, visibly fighting for composure. "I spent half my life believing I'd failed you, that you'd run away because I couldn't protect you, that you died somewhere, alone because I wasn't strong enough to stand between you and him. You were a child, Kane. I was your brother." The shout echoed in the small space. "I was supposed to keep you safe, and you vanished like smoke. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Stella's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I do, because I watched it happen from a distance. I hired investigators, kept tabs on you. I saw what you became, hard, ruthless, incapable of trust. I did that to you." "No." Kane's laugh was bitter, broken. "Our father did that. You just finished what he started." He moved closer and Eve saw his hands shaking. "Why didn't you tell me you were leaving? Why didn't you trust me enough to let me help you?" "Because you would have tried to come with me. Or worse, you would have tried to stop me and gotten hurt in the process." Stella stood on trembling legs, facing her brother across the narrow space. Father was getting worse, more violent, more possessive. "And you, Kane, you were starting to look at me with the same desperate need to control, to protect, to own. Not like Father did, not with that sickness, but with something almost as frightening. I was drowning in men who wanted to cage me, even if one cage was made of love and the other of abuse. So you chose neither. You chose to let me believe you were dead." "I never said I was dead. I just disappeared." Stella's voice broke. "I was 16 and terrified, and I thought if I could just get far enough away, we'd both be free. You from Father, me from both of you. I wrote you a letter explaining everything, but I couldn't bring myself to leave it. I was too afraid of what you'd do." "What I'd do?" Kane stared at her. "What did you think I'd do?" "I thought you'd kill him." The admission fell like a stone. "I thought you'd kill Father and destroy your own life in the process. And I was right, wasn't I? He died 6 months after I left. House fire. But we both know it wasn't an accident." The silence that followed was suffocating. Kane's face had gone pale, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I waited. Made sure you weren't coming back first. Made sure there was no hope of you walking through that door, so he could hurt you again. And then, yes, I locked him in his study and let him burn. I was 14 years old and I committed murder, and the only thing I regretted was that I couldn't make it slower." His eyes were black, bottomless. "Does that frighten you? Knowing your little brother became exactly the monster you feared?" "No." Stella took a step toward him, her hand outstretched. "It breaks my heart. Because you did it for me, and I wasn't even there to be saved." Kane recoiled from her touch as if it burned. Don't you dare make this about noble sacrifice. You left me alone with a corpse and a house full of ash, and the certain knowledge that everyone I loved would eventually abandon me. You don't get to frame that as tragedy when it was choice." "You're right." Stella lowered her hand, tears streaming down her face. "It was choice. A selfish, cowardly choice. I chose myself over you, and I've lived with that guilt every day for 24 years. I became a music teacher in Edinburgh, helped girls who'd been through what I'd been through, and every single one of them reminded me of the brother I'd left behind. I thought about coming back 1,000 times, but the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to face what I'd done. Eve had been silent throughout this exchange, barely breathing, but now she found her voice. "Then why come back now? Why after all this time?" Stella turned to her, and Eve saw recognition in her eyes. Not surprise, but acknowledgement, as if she'd been waiting for this question. "Because of you. When Aunt Helen told me Kane had contracted a marriage, had chosen a young woman who reminded him of me, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let him recreate his trauma through you." "I'm not a recreation," Eve said quietly. "I'm a person." "I know. That's what I realized when I saw you." Stella's gaze softened. "You're nothing like I was. You're stronger, braver. You don't run from hard things. And watching you with Kane, Seeing how you stand your ground even when he tries to push you away, I realized you might be able to save him in ways I never could." "I don't want to save him," Eve said, surprised by the truth of it. "I want to understand him. I want to choose him, not because I'm obligated by contract or because I'm trying to heal his wounds, but because despite everything, the darkness, the control, the fear, there's something real between us." Kane turned to her then, and the look in his eyes was raw, stripped of all pretense. "Real? You've known about Stella for hours and said nothing. You let me confess murder. Let me touch you. Let me fuck you in her room while keeping this secret. That's what you call real?" The words hit like blows, and Eve felt something crack inside her. "I found out 20 minutes before Mary screamed. I was trying to tell you—" "Trying isn't doing." Kane's voice was ice. "You had a dozen opportunities. In the hallway. In her room after. But you chose silence. Just like Stella chose silence. Just like everyone chooses silence when it comes to protecting me from truth." He looked between them, his sister and his wife, and Eve saw something die in his expression. "I'm surrounded by women who think they know what's best for me, who hide things for my own good, who love me so conditionally that honesty becomes optional." "That's not fair," Stella began. "No, you don't get to tell me what's fair." Kane's control was fracturing, his voice rising. "You don't get to disappear for 24 years and then show up to pass judgment on my life. You don't get to decide that Eve is good for me or that I need saving. You gave up those rights when you left. I was 16 and being raped by our father." Stella's shout matched his. "I was a child trying to survive. And I'm sorry I didn't handle it perfectly. Sorry I couldn't be strong enough to stay and fight. But I did the best I could with what I had. And yes, I left you. Yes, I hurt you, but I also freed you. Without me there, Father's attention wasn't split. And when you killed him, you weren't protecting me anymore. You were protecting yourself. You finally put yourself first. Maybe I gave you that, even if I didn't mean to." The silence that followed was absolute. Kane stared at his sister, as if seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. Not as the ghost he'd been chasing or the symbol of his failure, but as a person who'd made impossible choices in an impossible situation. His face worked through emotions too fast to track, and then suddenly, terribly, he broke. It wasn't loud. Kane didn't scream or rage. He simply sank to his knees in the middle of the cottage floor and put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep and primal. Eve had never seen him cry, hadn't thought him capable of it, but here he was, destroyed by the weight of grief and guilt and relief all crashing down at once. Stella moved first, dropping to her knees in front of him, her hands hovering uncertainly before settling on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Kane, for all of it. For leaving, for staying away, for letting you carry this alone." Kane's hands dropped and he looked at her with eyes that were raw and red and absolutely wrecked. "I missed you. Every day. Every single day I missed you. And I hated you for making me miss you. And I hated myself for not being enough to make you stay. You were always enough." Stella pulled him into her arms, and Kane collapsed into her embrace like a child. Like the 14-year-old boy who'd been left behind with nothing but ashes and questions. "You were always more than enough. I just wasn't strong enough to let you save me. I thought I had to save myself." They held each other and wept, two people trying to bridge a chasm carved by trauma and time, and Eve felt like an intruder on something sacred. She backed toward the door quietly, giving them space, but Kane's voice stopped her. "Don't." He didn't look up from Stella's shoulder, but his hand extended toward Eve, reaching. "Don't leave, please." Eve's throat tightened. She crossed the small room and knelt beside them, and when Kane's arm came around her, pulling her into the embrace, she felt the last of her walls crumble. They stayed like that for a long time. The three of them knotted together on the floor of the gamekeeper's cottage, two siblings trying to heal what had been broken, and a woman who'd accidentally become part of their story. Eventually, they moved to chairs. Mrs. Carmichael appeared at some point, her face streaked with tears, and made more tea. They talked through the night, unraveling years of secrets and lies and misunderstandings. Stella explained how she'd built a life in Edinburgh, how the guilt had eaten at her, how she'd finally returned 3 months ago after learning about Eve. Mrs. Carmichael confessed to facilitating Stella's hiding, to lying to Kane for decades, because Stella had begged her to, had convinced her that the truth would destroy him. "I wanted to tell you so many times," Mrs. Carmichael said to Kane, her voice shaking, "but Stella was convinced you'd either fall apart or come after her, and she wasn't ready for either." And as the years passed, the lie became its own kind of truth. It seemed kinder to let you grieve a sister you'd lost than to admit she'd chosen to stay lost. Kane listened to all of it with a stillness that was almost frightening, his hand gripping Eve's so tightly she lost feeling in her fingers. When the explanations finally ran dry, he spoke. "I don't know how to forgive this. Any of this. The lies, the abandonment, the years of letting me believe I'd failed." His voice was steady but hollow. "I don't know if I have that capacity left." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Stella said quietly. "I'm asking for a chance to know you again, to be your sister if you'll let me. Not the ghost you've been mourning, but the real person I am now, flawed and scared and trying to make amends." Kane looked at her for a long moment, and Eve could see him wrestling with it, could see the war between the wounded boy who wanted his sister back and the damaged man who'd learned that trust was a weapon people used against you. Finally he nodded. "I can't promise it will be easy. I can't promise I won't resent you or push you away. But I'll try. That's all I can offer. It's enough." Stella reached across the table, and this time when she took Kane's hand, he didn't pull away. "It's more than enough." Dawn was breaking when they finally left the cottage. Mrs. Carmichael returned to the manor to begin breakfast. Stella promised to come to the house later, after she'd rested, and Kane and Eve walked back across the moor in the grey morning light. They didn't speak, both too wrung out for words, but Kane's hand stayed wrapped around hers like an anchor. Inside the manor, they climbed the stairs to his bedroom. Eve expected him to pull her into bed, to seek comfort in the physical the way he always did, when emotions became too much. But instead he just stood by the window, staring out at the moor with his arms wrapped around himself, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. "I don't know who I am without the grief," he said finally. "I've built my entire life around her absence. Every choice, every relationship, every moment of cruelty. It was all rooted in the certainty that I'd failed her. And now she's alive. She chose to leave, and I don't know what to do with that." Eve moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You learn who you are without it. You decide what kind of person you want to be, now that the truth is different than you thought. What if I'm no one? What if the grief was the only thing holding me together? Then we find out together." Eve turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "Kane, I need to tell you something. Something I've been hiding." His eyes sharpened. "More secrets?" "One more." "The last one, I promise." Eve's heart hammered, but she forced the words out. "I'm pregnant." Kane went absolutely still. "What?" "I'm pregnant. About 6 weeks, I think. I've known for 2 weeks, but I was terrified to tell you. Terrified of what it would mean, how you'd react, whether you'd see it as another trap or another person you'd inevitably fail." The words tumbled out faster now. "I thought about terminating it, thought about hiding it until the contract was up, and then leaving. But I can't. I can't hide anymore, and I can't keep making choices out of fear. So I'm telling you. I'm carrying your child, and I don't know what happens next. But I need you to know." Kane stared at her, his face cycling through expressions: shock, fear, something that might have been wonder. Then, without warning, he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. His face buried in her hair, and she felt wetness on her neck. He was crying again, but differently this time. Not with grief, but with something else, something she couldn't quite name. "Please don't leave," he whispered against her skin. "Please, Eve, I know I don't deserve it. I know I've been cruel and controlling and impossible, but please don't take this away from me too." Eve's own tears started then, hot and fast. "I'm not leaving. I'm right here. The contract, fuck the contract." She pulled back enough to see his face. "I'm not staying because of money or obligation. I'm staying because somewhere in the middle of this nightmare, I fell in love with you. With all of you. The darkness and the damage and the terrible, beautiful mess you are. And I'm terrified of that. But I'm more terrified of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what we could have been." Kane's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I don't know how to love you the way you deserve. I don't know how to be gentle or kind or any of the things you should have. Then be yourself. Be honest, be present. That's all I need. Eve covered his hands with hers. We're both broken in different ways, Kane. Maybe we can be broken together and make something whole. He kissed her then, and it wasn't the claiming she'd grown accustomed to, or the desperate need of the night before. It was soft, almost reverent, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. And when he pulled back, his eyes held something she'd never seen before, hope tentative and fragile but real. I want to try, he said. I want to be better. For you, for our child, for the person I might have been if everything hadn't gone so wrong. His hand drifted to her still flat stomach, resting there with wonder. I'm going to fuck this up. Probably spectacularly, but I want to try. We'll fuck it up together. Eve smiled through her tears. That's what makes it love instead of performance. They made love then, slowly and carefully, and it was nothing like the times before. There was no pain, no claiming, no battle for control. Just two people finding each other in the wreckage of everything they'd survived, building something new from the ashes. And when it was over, they lay tangled together in the morning light, and Kane talked. He talked about his childhood before his mother died, when Ashford Manor had been filled with music and laughter. He talked about Stella when she was young, how she'd protected him from nightmares and taught him to play piano. He talked about the slow degradation of his father's sanity after his wife's death, how the man had turned his grief into something poisonous. He talked about the night he'd killed Richard Ashford, the smell of smoke and the terrible satisfaction of watching the flames consume the monster who'd destroyed his family. And Eve listened, holding him, offering no judgment or platitudes, just presence, just the gift of being witnessed in all his brokenness. When he finally fell silent, exhausted by confession, Eve shared her own stories. The man in the vestry who'd taught her to fear desire, her mother's illness and the slow erosion of their finances, the choice to accept Kane's contract, knowing it meant selling herself but seeing no other option, the weeks of falling for him despite every reason not to, of finding beauty in his darkness and strength in his vulnerability. We're both survivors, she said softly. We've both done things we're not proud of to stay alive, but maybe that's what qualifies us to love each other. We understand what it costs. Kane pulled her closer, his hand protective over her stomach. I'm going to be a father. That still doesn't feel real. You have 7 months to get used to it. What if I'm like him? What if there's something in me that's broken in the same way? Eve turned to face him fully. You're not your father, Kane. You're capable of terrible things, yes, but you're also capable of tremendous love. You protected Stella even when it cost you everything. You've kept her room preserved for 24 years, hoping she'd come home. You're not broken. You're wounded. And wounds can heal. He studied her face as if trying to memorize it. How did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just stubborn. I refuse to let the worst things that happened to us be the end of our stories. She kissed him softly. We get to write new chapters, Kane, together. Over the following weeks, Ashford Manor transformed. Stella moved into one of the guest rooms, and slowly, tentatively, she and Kane began to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't easy. There were arguments and silences and moments when the old wounds reopened. But there were also breakthroughs. The day Stella played piano for the first time in the music room, Kane sat and listened with tears streaming down his face. The night they spread their mother's photographs across the dining table and remembered her together, laughing through the grief. Mrs. Carmichael became part of the healing too, no longer carrying the burden of secrets alone. She confessed everything she'd hidden over the years, and while Kane struggled with the betrayal, he eventually understood. She'd been trying to protect both of them, caught between impossible loyalties. Eve's pregnancy progressed, her body changing in ways that fascinated and terrified Kane. He became obsessively protective, hiring the best doctors, reading every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could find, installing safety features throughout the manor that bordered on ridiculous. But underneath the control was fear that he'd lose this too, that happiness was too fragile to trust. One night, 3 months into her pregnancy, Eve woke to find Kane sitting by the window, staring out at the moor. Can't sleep? She asked. He shook his head. I keep thinking about the locked room, Stella's room. I haven't been able to bring myself to go in there since that night, since everything came out. Do you want to? I think I need to. Need to actually see it, without the weight of thinking she was dead. Need to say goodbye to the shrine and let it just be a room. He turned to her. Will you come with me? They climbed to the 3rd floor together, and Cain unlocked the door he'd forbidden her to enter all those weeks ago. Inside, the room was exactly as Eve remembered from her brief glimpse. Stella's photographs covering the walls, her sketches and journals on the desk, everything preserved like a museum exhibit. Cain moved through the space slowly, touching things with reverent fingers. I came here every year on her birthday, sat in her chair and tried to feel close to her. Pathetic, really. Not pathetic, human. Eve stood beside him. What do you want to do with it? Let it go. Pack up her things. Give them to her so she can decide what to keep. Make it into something else. Maybe... He paused, looking at Eve with sudden intensity. Maybe a nursery. If that's not too strange. Eve's heart swelled. I think it's perfect. Taking something that represented loss and making it into something that represents hope. They spent the next week transforming the room together, Stella helping sort through her old belongings and deciding what mattered. Most of the photographs went to her cottage. The sketches she wanted to display in her new teaching studio in York, she decided to move back permanently, to be close to the family she'd lost. The journals she kept, but the weight of their secrets no longer felt quite so crushing. The nursery came together slowly, soft yellows and greens replacing the shrine's somber tones, a crib that Cain spent hours assembling, cursing the instructions but refusing help. Shelves for books and toys that didn't exist yet but would. A rocking chair positioned by the window overlooking the moor. The night they finished, Cain stood in the center of the room and wept again, but this time with joy instead of grief. I never thought I'd have this, he said, pulling Eve into his arms. A family, a future, something other than isolation and control. You have it now. Eve rested her head on his chest. We both do. The pregnancy wasn't without complications. At 5 months, Eve began bleeding and was rushed to hospital in Leeds. The hours Cain spent in the waiting room, terrified and helpless, brought every fear to the surface. But the baby survived, strong and stubborn like its mother, and the scare only deepened Cain's commitment to being present, being better. He started therapy, working through the trauma of his childhood with a psychologist who specialized in abuse survivors. It was brutal work, dragging himself through memories he'd buried, confronting the ways his father's violence had shaped his understanding of love and power. But he did it, showing up week after week even when it destroyed him because he wanted to break the cycle. Wanted to give his child something he'd never had, a father who was capable of healthy love. Stella started therapy too, she and Cain sometimes attending sessions together to navigate their complicated history. Slowly, painfully, they learned to see each other as adults rather than the frightened children they'd been. Learned that forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but a process ongoing and imperfect. Eve's mother came to visit when Eve was 7 months pregnant, frail but stable on her new medications. Margaret wept when she saw her daughter, not with sadness but with relief and joy. Eve had been afraid her mother would judge her for the contract marriage, for selling herself. But Margaret simply held her and said, "You saved us both, and you found love in the process. That's more than most people get." The labor came 2 weeks early, fast and intense. Eve labored for 16 hours, while Cain held her hand and whispered encouragements, looking more terrified than she'd ever seen him. When their daughter finally arrived, perfect and screaming and absolutely real, Cain held her with shaking hands and sobbed openly. "She's beautiful," he kept saying. "She's so beautiful. She's perfect." They named her Rose Margaret Ashford after both grandmothers, and when Cain placed her in the nursery's crib for the first time, in the room that had once been a shrine to loss, he understood what transformation really meant. Not erasing the past, but building something new on top of it. Not forgetting what had been broken, but creating something whole. The first year of Rose's life was chaotic and exhausting, and more beautiful than anything Eve had imagined. Cain was a devoted father, obsessive in his care, waking for every midnight feeding even though Eve insisted he needed sleep. Stella was a constant presence, the aunt who spoiled Rose shamelessly and taught her nursery rhymes in a voice still haunted by old grief but getting stronger. The contract that had brought Eve to Ashford Manor expired without ceremony. Cain tore it up and proposed properly, on his knees in the music room where Eve played piano while Rose babbled in her bassinet. The ring was his mother's, an heirloom Stella had saved when she fled, now returned to serve a new generation. "I don't want you here because of obligation," Kane said, tears in his eyes. "I want you here because you choose me. Because we choose each other every day." "Yes," Eve said, pulling him up to kiss him. "Yes to choosing you. Yes to building a life together. Yes to all of it." They married in a small ceremony on the moor, just family, Stella and Mrs. Carmichael and Eve's mother, wrapped in blankets against the Yorkshire wind. Rose served as flower girl, carried by her aunt, gurgling happily. The words they exchanged weren't the cold legal contract of before, but vows written together, promising honesty and presence, and the courage to keep choosing each other even when it was hard. That night, after the celebration, after Rose was asleep and the house was quiet, Kane and Eve lay in bed together, and he told her something he'd never said before. "I love you. Not because you saved me or fixed me or gave me a family, but because you saw the worst of me and didn't run. Because you're brave enough to be broken with me. Because you're the first person who ever made me believe I deserved something good." His hand found hers in the darkness. "I love you, Eve Ashford, completely, terrifyingly, forever." Eve turned to him, her heart so full it hurt. "I love you too. All of you. The darkness and the light and everything in between." They made love slowly, tenderly, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something beautiful from the ruins. And when it was over, they held each other and listened to their daughter's soft breathing through the baby monitor, and they understood what they'd been fighting for all along. Not perfection. Not the erasure of pain, but the courage to love anyway. The strength to choose healing over hiding. The faith that broken things could still be beautiful if you gave them enough light. Outside, the moor stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky, and Ashford Manor stood solid and strong, no longer a mausoleum but a home. The ghosts had been confronted, the secrets revealed, the locked rooms opened to let in air and light. There would be hard days ahead. Trauma didn't vanish just because you named it, but they would face those days together, a family forged from ashes, transformed by the terrible and beautiful alchemy of love. And in the nursery that had once been a shrine to a disappeared girl, Rose Margaret Ashford slept peacefully, unaware that she was the symbol of everything her parents had survived to create. A future built on honesty instead of lies, a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. A story that started with a contract and ended with a choice. The choice to stay, to fight, to believe that even the most damaged hearts could learn to beat in rhythm if given the chance. The end wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for Eve and Kane, for Stella and the family they'd rebuilt from fragments, that was more than enough. It was everything.